Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets close out the season finale, losing at home to the Philadelphia 76ers, but one Cam Thomas refused to let the season end on a totally sour note, giving us another not entirely unfamiliar performance. We break down the game and whether or not this young man is deserving of being a part of the playoff future.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends. It is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets. Every single day over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator of DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast and your New Jersey Devils on the Devils Puck Luck podcast. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. And tell you today's episode is going to be brought to you by Prize Picks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. And Doug, what a way for the Nets to wrap things up against their eventual playoff opponent here in the Philadelphia 76ers. Can't be shocked that Cam Thomas absolutely goes off in the season finale.
No, look, he put up a show. They lost the game. The game doesn't really matter. We wanted to see the young guys. We knew the season was going to close like this. And Cam, I mean, the numbers are just kind of hilarious in what he's been able to do this year. 4 starts on the season. He had the 3-game stretch in February around the trade deadline. And then this game, the numbers are completely sick. He's averaging 39 points a game in those 4 starts.
That's right.
47% shooting, 47, 50, 94. Those are his splits, his shooting splits in his starts for the season. So it's in some ways, it's hilarious around this Nets season that it really can't end any other way, where this guy, when he's not starting, he's totally buried. And when he does start, he just drops massive scoring games. And it's just if there was going to be one storyline that the end season was going to end on when we knew the other guys weren't starting, this does feel very fitting for where like this Nets season ended up going. So I was totally here for it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it gave you something to root for in this final game. There's some other things in terms of Mikal Bridges getting his 83rd start of the season and then getting off the court along with all the other starters. But in terms of, it's funny, you mentioned something to root for and just like kind of nice moments to cap off the season. I think, unfortunately, unlike David Duke Jr., unlike Raiquan Gray, right? Unlike even Yuta Watanabe, or just guys getting some minutes here and some run in this final where you go, oh, that's nice. The Cam Thomas one does end up kind of being the both and. That's a heck of a performance. That is really nice. Also, why isn't this guy playing for the Brooklyn Nets? And it's somewhat hilarious that he couldn't find minutes when it was Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. Can't find minutes when it's Mikal Bridges, Spencer Dinwiddie, and Cam Johnson. Like, it's hard to wrap your head around a guy that's doing something like this so consistently, not having a more consistent role. And I think I finally figured out the logic behind it that the organization is using, even if it is not the right logic to be following. But overall, before we even get to that, did you, I don't know, you're not surprised by his performance, but are you surprised that the Nets even bothered playing him in a game like this? Actually, is my real question. Why even bother? Like, why keep giving the taste to the fan base of what this kid is capable of if you don't seem to have an intention of using him?
Well, this was definitely like end the bench G League day around the NBA. If you did a quick tour around like sort of what's been happening over the last basically 72 hours in the NBA, is that most teams have basically locked up where they are. I mean, we're seeing like some true nobodies when it comes to NBA status play around the league. So from that standpoint, I'm not all that surprised. But I was joking around before the game. I was like, Cam Thomas, this is like 2 hours before the game. I was like, Cam Thomas scores 40 or we're going to freak out. Like, of course, like you could just see it coming because this is sort of what they've done with him. So I'm not surprised by him playing. I mean, there's cases. I know what you're saying, because it's like he goes out there, he just scores so freaking efficiently every time in these starts when he's given the green light. I will say, like, there are other numbers. Like, the team's a negative in those, and like they're -2 or something like that in these minutes over the 50 minutes or so. So they haven't won the minutes. And by the way, I'm not even doing the win-loss record, like, because the win-loss record is 1-4. I'm only saying that because other people are going to say that. I'm going to say also the minutes they've lost. Like, he's been a really, really efficient scorer, and they've been outscored as a team in these super efficient minutes by him. So I can see why not. But I know what you're saying, because you're like, it does seem to tantalize the fan base in the worst possible way, because, I mean, these numbers are ridiculous. It's all he does. There's no assists. There's nothing else there. But when given the ball and when he gets hot, it's kind of singular, because you can see it coming. You're like, he's not missing. I'm disappointed he didn't get over 50 today.
Yeah, I know. He was a little bit lazy towards the back end of this game. I mean, honestly, buddy, you go all the way.
They were trapping him. Like, they're trapping this totally meaningless game, and they were scheming against Cam Thomas to end the game just because they didn't want him to get over 50, because they didn't want him to, like, put a notch in the belt. I thought that was funny too. I mean, there were some, like, pretty funny subplots going on here.
There is who was it? Raiquan Gray and Dedmon, right? Like, they're jawing at each other going into a timeout after Raiquan Gray gets called on the travel, but clearly didn't like something that was going on there. And he's giving him the, hey, you traveled sign. He goes, man, like, and you're watching a guy that had a great G League season like talking trash at an NBA veteran player. So to your point, there was some interesting things. Before we get into coming up here in the second segment, a case that I'll make for Cam Thomas to have a role here in these playoffs. The last thing that I did find that I think I came to the conclusion to in watching a performance like this from Cam and saying, what's going on? I don't think it's right or necessarily what you should do. But my belief is now that the Brooklyn Nets come out of the Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving era. One superstar, they probably feel like it was fine. It just didn't work out, and that's Kevin Durant. The other one, a much more difficult experience with Kyrie Irving. And they have in Cam Thomas a guy that now was around these players for a season and a half. And I think that there's some trepidation around this kid can be a star. But what we can't have happen is maybe have him go. And there's no judgment on Kyrie Irving. Just can't have him go the Kyrie Irving path. We cannot have a superstar that gets away from us and maybe doesn't buy into what we want to build here. Do I think that they've maybe gone completely overboard in trying to bring him along and instill some other skills? 100%. You mentioned the stats that also make it an indication of he's not a complete player yet. So while he can do these things offensively, if it doesn't translate to consistent wins, then it also is an issue that you can solely tie to basketball. But that's actually where I think the Brooklyn Nets stand on this, that he's 21 years old. We still have plenty of time with him to turn him into the superstar or contributor we want him to be. And we don't have to risk it at any point. I think it's flawed, but that ultimately is what I believe this organization is trying to do with him, because they're a little bit shell-shocked from the last superstar era.
Yeah, I think it's probably a mix of a bunch of different things is my guess. Like I said, there's different ways to slice of this where it doesn't look great. Like, even though it's really hard to say that, it's like, hey, you average 40 points a game in 4 starts. Like, it's pretty hard to dump cold water on that, because that is really, really hard to do. It is funny that there's even like some case for it. And I think that in and of itself is almost like where maybe the organization stands. All right, we're going to talk a little bit more of this Cam Thomas, maybe look a little ahead to some of these guys and where the playoffs might round out. We'll get into that in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. That's because over on Prize Picks, all you're doing is going against the Prize Picks player projections on your entries. You're going more or less, and you're just going up against the numbers. Like, if you want to say, maybe today was Cam Thomas more than 30 points. I mean, you got there so easily. If you knew that was coming, we could have seen this coming a mile away over on Prize Picks, right? Like, Cam Thomas 30, he's going to get that by halftime. That's the way this guy rolls. This guy's like Will Chamberlain in his prime when it comes to scoring. That is sort of what you're doing on Prize Picks, because I say sort of, it's not just points, rebounds, assists, blocks, steals. That's just the NBA. You go over there for MLB as well, home runs, strikeouts. It's all there for you on Prize Picks. You go 2 to 6 players, figure out if they're going to score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, and you can win up to 25 times your money. You're not competing against other people. It's just you versus those projections. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less, safe and fast withdrawals. Currently rolling in more than 30 states and our friends to the north in Canada. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up to play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with that promo code locked on. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you 100. Deposit 50, Prize Picks will give you 50. Don't forget to enter the promo code locked on and sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy made easy.
Okay, so ultimately what turns out to be a 134-105 loss to close out the season for the Brooklyn Nets. They end up finishing, oddly enough, I want to get into this Cam Thomas thing a little bit more, but they do end up finishing 13-15 after the trade from when Spencer Dinwiddie started. Now, it's funny. So you say 13-14, they almost finished 500, but then you have to tack on an extra couple of games there before Mikal Bridges even started playing. So this is a team that, all in all, finished the season, and you could say, hey, they're above 500 type of team. And it goes back to a little bit of what we discussed in our last episode about, are they a true 6 seed? Even after all of this, where would you rank them with that 7 through 10? When we talk about the play-in teams, I still think they're a team that lives in that area. Now, though, as we do look a little bit ahead here to the playoffs, I'll put this pretty simply. Whatever Cam Thomas cannot do, whatever his deficiencies in his game are, it's no worse than what Seth Curry lacks. And the idea that you've spent the back end of this season playing a guy, a veteran 30-plus-year-old expiring contract for 10 to 15 or 2 minutes a game over Cam Thomas, that's where I'm drawing the line with the Nets organization and saying there's got to just be a world where it's worth it to put Cam out there for those minutes, especially in an upcoming playoff series that you're going to need a guy that can do that for you at some stretch here to alleviate the pressure on Mikal and on Spencer and all these other starters you've had. That part of it confounds me to a certain extent. And we know the things we talked about with some level of respect towards veterans that have been here on this team.
Yeah, so you're saying you want to see less Curry. I agree with you on that.
I want to see no Curry.
That I don't know if like Cam is the analog here. Like if it's like if it can't be one, it has to be the other. I agree with part of that statement and probably don't agree with going fully like that should be where the minutes get replaced. I do agree with you that we saw, and we talked about this, like, this is why I said this is the perfect encapsulation to some degree of this Nets season among many different things. It's like, we never saw this guy. And when we did, it just, you're like, would be so confused about why you never saw him. Right. And and we obviously got frustrated with some of these Seth Curry minutes. So, last game was a good one, but he's had long stretches where it's looked pretty rough this season. I think it is funny you compare those two guys, because on the one hand, I agree with you that I do not want to see that much Curry in the playoffs although some people were saying like he's been a sixer killer, and which I find funny, but I think that's not probably a good enough reason. But if you look at so I was looking at this earlier, if you go from the trade deadline on, just like net stats and net rating and stuff, I'm going to knock out to the 2 10-day contract guys. The 2 lowest net ratings on the Nets since the trade deadline. Are you ready for it? Bury the lead here. Cam Thomas and Seth Curry. Cam is a minus 14.8. This didn't include today, although they lost the minute, so it's not going to necessarily improve. Cam was a minus 11.2, and Curry was a minus 8.3, and kind of no one else was that close. It is funny that these two guys, who can be like sort of frustrating and confusing, and you want to maybe put them together because they're sort of like classic shooting guards, and like they have a lot of things that are similar, at least in terms of like their size. There's like similarities, even if their games are not necessarily the same.
And including the value to this team, right?
It's like, man, maybe we don't play either.
Right.
Like maybe neither is really the solution. I hate dumping on Cam here. Like, it was a huge game. I'm really not trying to do that, but it is funny that you brought up Seth, because it's like, so like he has this huge game. He has 1 assist. Like, I don't know, you want to call it empty calories a little bit, maybe. It is hard, I think, to play. I think one of the things, and the case against Cam in the playoffs, and really Curry too, is ultimately when you're a really small shooting guard, it's going to be like in the current NBA, it's going to be really problematic for you. Like, it's just really hard. Like, the only time you can be like kind of an undersized 2 guard at this point is if you're like Donovan Mitchell, right? Like there's very few examples of these guys that are so good as like sort of off-ball scorers. And so while I think that the Cam thing is perpetually confusing because he does score a lot, I think there are plenty of reasons why you don't see it as a long-term solution. I guess we can probably get into more of that. Does that make sense? Like what I'm saying? Like, I think this is why, like, sort of, it's mostly this archetype of guy is hard to play in the NBA. It's not so much any one of their wrong things. It's like, it's just hard to be this kind of guy in the current NBA and be really good. There's like a lot of flaws in the game.
Yeah, and ironically enough, in this game, you're talking about watching a lot of bench players and backup guys for both sides of this matchup. And at one point I was like, Well, you put all the backups and the backups on the court together, and what do you see? Still a lot more length over on Philadelphia, right? When you have Patty Mills and Cam Thomas out there for the Brooklyn Nets, it is a reminder of the things that the Brooklyn Nets as a team, as a roster construction, still have a lot of work to do on. And to your point, if you're not going to be, there are guys that can, it's funny. I did see a tweet about this, which I think is fair to say, saying that there's, 300 guys that could do the same thing that Cam Thomas does. Well, no, it takes a very elite skill set to accomplish that. However, the counterpoint would be, and this is for Seth Curry as well, there are 300 to 400 guys that can do a lot of things that Cam Thomas cannot do. And when the small stature comes into effect here, you do end up looking at saying, I do need complete players. I mean, that goes across the board. Now, if you're the elite of the elite talents, you get to not worry about those other things, and the other guys around you need to pick that up. And ultimately, I still look at this game and the samples we've seen across this season. I just pulled it up, by the way. I'm a little bit shocked that when you go in and look, Cam Thomas has appeared in 56 games this season and averages 16 minutes a night. Like, when you go and look at his stat lines for the year, you can sit here and say, yeah, this is a guy that can continue to build and grow. I think the balancing act right now for the Nets is not, in some ways, feeling like they're throwing away wins or losses, throwing away opportunities to develop this young player. And I would make the case that if this had been a different season where the Nets never had Kevin Durant or Kyrie Irving at all this year, then there would have been a different approach to how you develop Cam Thomas. I still think it might not have been the best. Like, I'll make a very strong case that Cam Thomas should have been in the G League all year if you weren't going to play him consistently at the NBA level, because then you can still let him develop. But as you and I saw in Summer League, then you end up with Cam Thomas just going nuclear game after game, and I don't know if that develops him correctly. So it's funny, man. I feel like we're doing this both and thing of like, what a great performance from Cam, and here's all the reasons why it doesn't really matter. But it is still great, and it is still a great game from him, and a great performance that he's given us.
This is what I meant about it's the perfect example. Like, this couldn't have worked out any more perfectly for the question marks around the situation. Yeah. This is like what makes it so funny is that it's such a gray area. Like, it's really hard to encapsulate and define because, and that's why I'm if the stars weren't going to play, or the starting lineup wasn't going to play, this was the perfect thing to be able to sort of talk about, because this has been a recurring through line for us all season is around this specific guy and like what is going on and why he doesn't play. And when he does play, it looks like this. And then you never see it. And it's funny you brought up his season averages. This is where you really want to dive in what the difference is between mean and median, because the mean is going to look like the mean is going to look much different than the median, because the highs are the highest of highs. And then literally there's nothing else that happens. So like the median number for his minutes is so much lower. It's got to be so much lower than 16, right? Like it's just because he didn't play tons, except that when he played all the minutes and scored all the points, and then he would just sort of disappear. And in the other ways, like Cam, we've also seen off nights from Cam, and it looks bad, right? Because it's like there's not much else that happens besides scoring. And so when he's not scoring, like literally nothing happens for him. And so that's, and maybe that's the whole story, right? Like maybe the whole story is just that this is it. It's like he can score at an absolute elite level. No doubt about it. There's no question. The science is solved. Cam Thomas can score at an elite level on the NBA. The problem is he can't seemingly do anything else. And while scoring is the most important thing, it is not the only thing. And when you are subpar, or even well below that, and in every other phase of the game, ball distribution, running pick and roll, like defense, anything else, if like you're way, way, way behind in all the other areas, then his situation does start making a lot more sense.
So coming up here in a second, we will talk about the other players that got an opportunity here, from David Duke Jr. to Raiquan Gray and also Day'Ron Sharpe, and just really what this season finale encapsulates for the Brooklyn Nets, where guess what? They were allowed to reward young players because it was a, quote, meaningless game. All
right, before we get to that, talk to you about our friends over at Ultimate Pro Basketball GM. It's the coolest game we've played in a long time. If you've been in the Locked On NBA group chat, people are absolutely losing their minds about Ultimate Pro Basketball GM for good reason. It's because you are able to put together a full basketball franchise with every aspect of it. You play through the seasons, you lead your franchise and fans to glory, you build dynasties, you run it through simulations, you deal with challenging personalities, you go through hiring coaches and assistants, trading and trading players. Maybe in your Ultimate GM, you'd start Cam Thomas, play him every game. We'll see. Let's go through it and work it out. We'll start the analog of him through Ultimate GM. Let's see how it works out for your team. That is what you get to do with this game. It's in a challenging, it's a realistic game world. Completely free. Ultimate Basketball or Pro Basketball GM is. You can play it offline as well. You play on the go. You can start and stop as you want to. If you're into this kind of high level stuff for basketball, it is the game for you. Locked On Nets listeners get 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in the game store. Make sure to check it out. Download the game. Just visit probasketballgm.com. Scan the code. Look it up in the app stores. That's probasketballgm.com. Ultimate Basketball GM. Start your dynasty today.
All right. So this is where I think we get to the point that is a really nice accomplishment. And we heard Jacques Vaughn talk about this before the game and what they were trying to do down the stretch here, convincing themselves that there is a goal here in mind, that building towards these playoffs matters for us, that being in a position to not have to care about who plays in the final game of the season was actually really important for them because it signals that it didn't have to come down to the wire. They weren't scraping or watching Miami's games to see who won or lost and staying clear of those playing games. Now, in that, they did one other thing. I already mentioned last episode about David Duke Jr. He'll actually be able to go to the playoffs. We'll talk about him in a second. The other guy I'm just going to highlight is Raiquan Gray, simply because they converted him to a two-way contract specifically to be able to bring him up here. And that's a reward for the Long Island Nets, who had an incredible season of their own where Gray, DDJ, these guys were key contributors. Drew Smith was a key contributor there as well. I think it's another one of those resetting of the fancy word culture for the Brooklyn Nets where you go, here's young guys that are working and developing really hard. Here's your taste. Now, for David Duke Jr., it matters far less because he's been up at the NBA level, but he gets to go to the playoffs. For those other two guys, this is, there's something at the end of this for you. If you keep hustling and grinding away, there is this path for you to be a contributor for us at the NBA level. And here's that little bone or that little taste. I know this is all fluff, but I actually really like it.
Yeah, look, they were both really good today. And David Duke Jr. probably should have started. They started Mikal just so they could keep the streak alive. Yeah. Obviously, he was there for, a heartbeat, and then he got off the court. So, David Duke Jr. was essentially the starter, but they did it to keep Bridges' thing going. They look fine today, right? Like, they look good. Like, the hustle was there. That's what you want to get out of these games. Like, David Duke Jr. is able to get to the rack. We've known that many times. We've known that for a while, that, speed in that part of his game is at an NBA level. Like a lot of these other guys, you're always going to be able to pinpoint certain things they do really well, and then there's going to be certain deficiencies as well. Raiquan has not gotten any smaller since the summer league. He looks like he could start middle linebacker for the Jets. Like, he is huge. And we knew that from the summer league too. Like, he's just a really, really big dude. Good agility, footwork is pretty good. Has actually decent court vision. He's another one of these guys, like always with these guys. And I only throw the caveats in there because sometimes it's hard to tell why they don't play more when you see them in situations like this, is that there's just other pieces of their game that aren't fully formed at an NBA level. And when you get, 3/4 of a summer league or G League game like you get today, it's a nice place to put on something of a showcase. I thought both of them played really well. I'm not surprised by any of the performances necessarily. It doesn't change my opinion too much of them as like contributors here. And I think you are correct in your assessment of, hey, these guys balled out at the G League level this year for Long Island. Let's let them run some minutes here and get them on the NBA court. And then that's just going to be what it is. But I'm not sure my opinion of it changes too much.
No, I will say from like a Gray standpoint, because he's been with the team now for a couple of seasons, maybe 3 seasons now. I think just 2. But in his time, you can say, hey, look at the development. You mentioned about at the NBA level. Well, Gray is a 17% career 3-point shooter at the G League level. Now, when he comes up here and ends up going 2 for 5, you say, listen, maybe it's just the bright lights that he needs to really inspire him. But his overall game was something where I think, again, and you and I don't mean this isn't negatively, you and I disagree on the idea of like, can a guy develop? Like, can you end up being a guy that's a second or late round pick and turn into something? I think it's few and far between that it occurs, But when you see a player like a Nicholas Claxton over years really evolve and grow, you think about, can organizationally you bring along players like this? Do I think Gray's that guy, to your point about how big he is? Maybe not, but he sure is light-footed for a guy of that size. So it's a fun game to watch from him. And frankly, the one thing that he did that was a terrible job on his part was having 7 assists as a big man such as himself, because it took away the possibility of David Duke Jr. getting the double-double that I was calling for coming into this game. He, to your point, did all the things he can do, did the thing that he can't do, which is knock down triples, at least with consistency, 0 for 4 from beyond the arc. With him going to the playoffs with this team, I will again, you mentioned the idea of, well, guess what? Neither Cam Thomas nor Seth Curry, they're the 2 worst net rating guys for this team. If you told me there was a situational spot in a playoff game where you'd rather sick David Duke Jr. defensively on someone for Philadelphia, I could buy into that. Not because I think it's the answer, but I know what isn't the answer when it comes to some of those assignments. And we're going to talk about this week matchups and different things that are going to matter for Brooklyn. I just do look at David Duke Jr. and say, whatever he isn't, what he is something you lack on your current NBA roster. And he's a fascinating case, I think, for me, what happens to him in the offseason and going forward. Is he ever going to get to a place where he's viewed as an NBA level contributor for the Brooklyn Nets or anywhere, frankly?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I would just assume those minutes go to Sumner. Like if it's going to be, if we're just looking, if we're just looking for guys like that. And I know he didn't play today. I actually thought he would play, just because this seemed
it's
like
a good sign that he didn't, right? Like him not playing is a better sign for his playoff outlook.
Yeah, and he played in some of these not crunch time minutes, but he played in some of these games down the stretch, specifically the last game that they really need to win. I hear what you're saying on Duke, that from an archetype standpoint, they don't have a lot of guys like this, point of attack defenders. I would just say that Sumner's just better than him. But but the point is correct. I just would change the name. But I think it was easy to forget about him because he just didn't play today. He's like one of these middling guys because he didn't play today, but he doesn't really play a ton other times either. Like, even though the numbers for him, actually, it's funny about him because different than, we're still talking about Sumner. He didn't even play today. But when I was talking about the net rating stuff, Sumner had, I thought this number was better. And he was a negative too. I take it back because he had like the third best 3-man combo the Nets had that was not a Kevin Durant lineup this year. Sumner was in it. Anyway, point being, I'm with you on David Duke Jr. I really like watching him play. For some reason in my mind, he's always a lefty. And then I go watch him play and he's actually right-handed. I'm not sure like where in my mind when I picture David Duke Jr., he's a left-handed player. And then obviously he's clearly not. And every time it happens, every time I think it, then he shoots and I'm like, oh, he's righty. Then I forget, and then he plays again later. I'm like, that's right, he's not a lefty. I don't know where that came from.
Spend the first half of a quarter every time you watch him going, God, this guy is ambidextrous as hell. He's going the other hand every single time off the floor. It's incredible.
Maybe I like think of him as like a Darren Fox type or something. Like, I'm not sure why I always think he's going to be lefty, and he just isn't.
So as a reminder here, as we wrap up this episode here, and happy Easter if that's your bag on a Sunday such as today. I hope you're enjoying yourself. That this week we're going to dive into a lot of different things. We're going to look back at this season, give out some of our season awards as we've done over the years of this podcast, and then, yes, dive into the playoff matchup with the Philadelphia 76ers. But just tying a bow, I think, on this season right now, you finished 45-37. I mentioned basically a 500 team after the trades all go down. I do think, and we've mentioned this before, that the Nets accomplished the goal of resetting the perception of how, quote, bad this was going to get after you gave up those stars. It'll be really fascinating for me to see what these players do, what the starting unit does when it comes to a potentially 4, 5, 6-game playoff series. I know, but whatever you're going to get here against the Philadelphia 76ers, how do these guys look? Because you're still talking about trying to develop chemistry amongst a roster and a team that had 28 to 30 games together. And that's a lot to accomplish over a very short stretch of the season. And I'll remind everybody, whether it's the way Cam Johnson looks, whether it's the way Day'Ron Sharpe looks, whether it's the way Jacques Vaughn looks as a coach in the playoffs, continue to remind yourself, this is a 4/5 new starting lineup for the Brooklyn Nets after the trade. It takes time to develop this stuff, and most of it should be, man, what a great moment here. What a great play there. These are things we can carry over beyond this season.
Hey, look, Nets are going to the playoffs. Kyrie Irving isn't. Old friend. So not everyone from the early season Nets is going to the playoffs. So I think from that standpoint, not rooting against Kyrie. Actually, it's funny about that because he was great. It was just didn't seem to be on him there. The whole thing went off the rails. But yeah, look, this is higher than I thought they were going to finish the season after the trade deadline. I think it's a monumental victory. I think there's no other way to cut it. This is, at least for my expectations, I thought it was play in or bust, and they didn't do it. Like, kudos to them. This was a very, very successful last run of the last couple months of the season. For at least for me, significantly outkicked my expectations.
Yeah, I've loved all of it. So like I said, we'll dive into all that, including talking, by the way, just what's gone on around the league with the play-ins and how the NBA is trying to navigate mitigating tanking. That seems to still not be working for them. So we have a fun NBA playoff preview and then wrapping up the season kind of week coming up here. So it's going to be a lot of good episodes to tap into.
Yeah, really excited to break it down. Like I said, we'll have a whole week of just kind of recapping the season, looking ahead to the playoffs. Like Adam said, this should be a really, really fun one. There's a ton of ways to slice this. Old friends, the Sixers, total cowards sitting all their starters today. Just a little preview for the. They could have run out the guys. We needed the rest. They had something to prove. Okay, we are going to get out of here. Much appreciate everyone that jumped into YouTube. I'm not sure we'll stick around. Maybe no, Adam, I think he's got an out here. So maybe for today for YouTube, we are not going to stick around, but we will be back again later this week talking more Brooklyn. Oh no, what's the quote? Give us the quote. There you go. I'm screwing this whole thing up. Yeah, I'm way off my game here.
As am I, by the way.
You got to go. It's the whole thing here. Let's close the podcast. We'll get notes from the network about how not to close the podcast, because this is basically it.
There's no better way than having your co-host take it on the chin when he paused for you to give the quote like you're supposed to do at the end of episodes. So by the way, friends, if you focus on what you left behind, you will never be able to see what lies ahead. That's Gusto. Yes, from Ratatouille.
Oh, one of the all-time great non-American poets. We'll be back again next week. No, excuse me, tomorrow. I'm all screwed up. We'll be back some other time talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.